I want to start by telling you something that took me a long time to accept. Something that still makes my stomach turn a little every time I say it out loud. There is a version of danger that comes with paperwork attached to it. A version where you can hand someone photographs, timestamps, physical evidence laid out on a table in front of them, and still be told, gently, almost apologetically, that there's nothing they can do. That's the story I want to tell you tonight. Not a story about a stranger in the dark. A story about a man I used to love, a key I thought I'd taken back, and a police department that looked at everything I had and told me, more or less, that I was on my own. My ex and I dated for a little over 2 years. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the relationship itself because that's not really what this story is about. But I want to give you enough to understand the shape of him, the specific kind of control he was used to having before I ended things. He wasn't violent, not in any way I could have pointed to at the time, not in any way that would have shown up in a police report while we were together. He was controlling in quieter ways. He liked to know where I was. He liked to have opinions about who I spent time with, what I wore, how late I stayed out with friends who weren't him. I told myself for most of those 2 years that it was just how he showed he cared, that some people are simply more attentive than others, more invested. It took me embarrassingly long to understand that attentiveness and control aren't always the same thing, but they can look identical from the inside of a relationship, especially when you love someone and want badly to believe the best interpretation of everything they do. Looking back, there were smaller versions of this exact pattern all through the relationship, versions I explained away at the time, the same way I'd later explain away the closed blinds and the moved dish. He knew my work schedule better than I did some weeks, texting the moment I should have been walking out of a meeting, as though he'd been tracking the minutes. He commented once, early on, in a tone I mistook for playful, that he liked knowing where all my things were, a phrase that included, somehow, without either of us questioning it out loud, me. I didn't think of myself as a thing that could be known and tracked the way you'd know the location of a set of keys. But I understand now, with the particular clarity that only comes after the fact, that he did, that the ending of our relationship was never in his mind a full and complete removal of that ownership. It was a pause, a door he considered ajar rather than closed, regardless of what I believed I had locked behind him.
I ended it in March, on a Tuesday evening, in my own apartment, calmly, the way you're supposed to end things when you're trying to avoid drama, trying to preserve some version of mutual respect, even as the relationship falls apart underneath you. He took it hard, but not explosively. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He asked quietly if I was sure, and when I said I was, he nodded, gathered the handful of things he kept at my place, and left. I remember feeling that night an enormous guilty relief, the specific relief of finally setting down something heavy you didn't fully realize you'd been carrying. I asked for my spare key back before he left that night. He handed it to me without argument, dropped it into my palm with a small, resigned smile that I read at the time as sadness. I locked the door behind him. I remember locking it twice, checking the handle, the small ritual of a person trying to feel safe in a space that suddenly felt different than it had that morning. I didn't think about that key again for almost 6 weeks. The first sign that something was wrong was so small I nearly didn't register it as a sign at all. I came home from work one evening in early May and found my apartment slightly different than I'd left it, in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The blinds in my living room, which I always leave half open during the day for light, were fully closed. I stood in my doorway for a moment, keys still in my hand, running through the morning in my mind, trying to remember if I'd closed them myself in some distracted, forgotten moment before work. I couldn't remember doing it, but I also couldn't be certain I hadn't. That's the specific texture of this kind of fear when it first starts. Not certainty, just a small nagging discrepancy between what you remember and what you're looking at, small enough to dismiss, persistent enough to leave a residue. I closed the blinds myself sometimes, I told myself. I was tired that morning, distracted, rushing to catch the bus. It was entirely possible I'd done it without remembering. I made dinner, I went to bed, and I didn't think much more about it, though some quiet part of my mind filed the moment away regardless, the way your body sometimes remembers a threat before your conscious mind has agreed to take it seriously. 10 days later, it happened again, except this time the detail was harder to explain away. I keep a small dish by my front door where I drop my keys the moment I walk in, an old ceramic thing my grandmother gave me, chipped on one edge, the kind of object you stop noticing because it's simply always been there. I came home and found it moved, not gone, not broken, just moved 3 or 4 inches to the left, sitting slightly askew on the narrow entryway table where it lives. I stood there staring at it for a long time, the way you stare at something that shouldn't be able to unsettle you as much as it does. A dish, moved a few inches. It sounds almost absurd to describe as frightening, but I knew exactly where that dish sat, the precise spot, worn slightly into the finish of the table from years of the same placement, and it was not sitting in that spot anymore. I told a friend about it over the phone that night, half laughing at myself even as I said it, framing it as something silly, something I was probably imagining. She was kind about it, the way good friends are, but I could hear the slight skepticism in her voice, the gentle, well-meaning suggestion that maybe I was still processing the breakup in ways that were manifesting as anxiety, as hypervigilance, as a mind looking for patterns in an apartment that hadn't actually changed at all. She reminded me, gently, that grief and breakups can do strange things to memory, that it's common to misremember small domestic details during periods of stress, and I let myself agree with her, because agreeing with her was so much easier than sitting with the alternative. I told myself she was probably right. I wanted her to be right. The alternative was so much worse. 3 weeks passed without anything unusual happening, and I let myself relax into that stretch of normalcy the way you always do, gratefully, gladly, telling yourself that whatever had unsettled you before was clearly nothing, clearly your own mind working against you during a vulnerable stretch of time. And then, on a Thursday night in early June, I came home to find something that I could not, no matter how hard I tried, explain away as my own forgetfulness.
My bed was made. I do not make my bed in the morning. I want to say that plainly because it matters enormously to everything that follows. I have never been a person who makes her bed, not since college, not once in the years I'd lived in that apartment. I leave it exactly as I get out of it, sheets pushed back, pillow askew, and I have always meant to develop better habits and never quite managed it. That Thursday, I walked into my bedroom and found the bed made, tight and neat, the comforter smoothed flat, the pillows arranged with a precision I have never once achieved myself, even on the rare mornings I've tried. There was something almost tender about the way it had been done, the corners tucked with real care rather than the rushed, careless straightening you'd expect from someone simply passing through. It looked, if I'm honest, like a bed made by someone who used to make that same bed for both of us on lazy weekend mornings, someone whose hands remembered the exact rhythm of that particular comforter without needing to think about it. I stood in my bedroom doorway for what felt like a very long time, feeling something crack open in my chest, a specific, cold certainty finally replacing the doubt I'd been living in for weeks. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing, had smoothed my sheets, had arranged my pillows with careful, deliberate attention, the way you'd tidy a home you still felt some ownership over, some right to tend. I thought immediately of him, of the key I'd taken back, of the small, resigned smile he'd given me when he handed it over. I told myself it couldn't be that simple, that surely he wouldn't have kept a copy, that surely 2 years together hadn't ended with something as clumsy and obvious as a duplicate key in his pocket. I called a locksmith the next morning and had the locks changed, paying an emergency rate I couldn't really afford, watching with a strange mix of relief and lingering unease as the old cylinder came out and a new one went in. I told myself that was the end of it, whatever it had been, whoever it had been. New locks meant a clean break, a physical boundary re-established. For almost a month, nothing happened, and I let myself believe, again, that it was over. It wasn't over. On a Sunday afternoon in July, I came home from a weekend trip to find my refrigerator restocked. Not tampered with, not raided, restocked with specific items I recognized as things he used to buy for me during our relationship. A particular brand of orange juice I liked, a type of yogurt I'd mentioned once, months earlier in some forgotten conversation that I'd been meaning to try. I stood in my kitchen with the refrigerator door open, cold air spilling out around me, staring at groceries I hadn't purchased, arranged with the same careful, deliberate precision as the bed had been, and I understood, with total clarity, that new locks had not been the boundary I'd believed them to be. I want to walk you through what it actually feels like to realize that someone still has access to the one place you're supposed to be safest, because I don't think people who haven't lived through it fully understand the specific, disorienting horror of it. It's not like being afraid of an intruder in the traditional sense, some stranger breaking in violently, glass shattering, alarms sounding. It's quieter than that, and somehow worse. It's the horror of realizing that the walls you've always trusted to keep the world out have, in fact, been letting someone in this whole time, gently, carefully, without ever breaking anything, without ever leaving a mark you could easily point to and say, there, that's proof of forced entry. I called a second locksmith, a different company this time, and had every lock in the apartment replaced again, plus a deadbolt added to the interior door that hadn't had one before. I also, for the first time, called the police. I sat with an officer in my living room for almost an hour, walking him through everything: the closed blinds, the moved dish, the made bed, the restocked refrigerator, watching his expression shift from polite attentiveness to something more careful, more measured, the specific look of someone who believes you completely and still has to explain why belief isn't the same as being able to act. He told me, as gently as he could manage, that without any sign of forced entry, without a working lock that had actually been broken or bypassed, rather than simply used with a key that may or may not still exist somewhere, there wasn't much of a crime he could formally document. A restocked refrigerator isn't theft. A made bed isn't vandalism. Even the moved dish, even the closed blinds, read on paper like the kind of details a stressed, recently single person might misremember or misattribute to something sinister rather than their own distracted mind. He believed me, he said, more than once in a tone that felt genuinely sincere rather than dismissive. But belief wasn't evidence, and evidence was what any formal action would require. I asked him directly what I was supposed to do.
He suggested a security camera, suggested I document everything meticulously going forward, suggested that if I ever had a concrete image of my ex actually inside the apartment, actually caught in the act, that would change the calculus entirely, would give them something they could work with. I remember feeling a strange, bitter kind of clarity in that moment, the understanding that I was going to have to build my own case, gather my own proof, essentially do the investigative work myself before anyone with actual authority would step in to help me. I installed 3 cameras that week, one covering the front door and hallway approach, one covering the living room, and one, the one that felt the most invasive to set up, covering my own bedroom, because that was where the most violating incident had happened, where a stranger's hands had touched my sheets and pillows while I was at work, oblivious, going about an ordinary day. For nearly 5 weeks, the cameras caught nothing except my own comings and goings, and I started to wonder in the quiet hours of those uneventful weeks whether I'd simply scared him off, whether the new locks and the obvious presence of cameras visible from the hallway had been enough to end it for good.
Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, while I was at work, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the hallway camera. I remember exactly where I was when I opened it, standing in a break room at my office, coffee in hand, mid-conversation with a coworker about something completely unrelated, some forgettable detail of the day that I couldn't recall now if you ask me. I remember the specific, sickening drop in my stomach as the footage loaded, and I watched a man I recognized immediately, despite the grainy quality of the feed, approach my front door, produce a key from his pocket, and let himself in, calm, unhurried, moving with the easy familiarity of someone entering a space he still considered, on some level, partly his own. I watched the footage 3 or 4 times before I could bring myself to move, standing frozen in that break room with my coworker, asking from what felt like a great distance if I was okay. I remember the particular way he checked over his shoulder before inserting the key, not a nervous, guilty glance, but something closer to habit, the reflexive caution of someone who has done this exact motion enough times to have developed a routine around it, a small ritual of checking the hallway before letting himself into a home that hadn't been his in months. That detail unsettled me more than almost anything else about the footage. Not the entry itself, but the ease of it, the practiced quality. This was not a man breaking in for the first time, hands shaking, decision made in some reckless, desperate moment. This was a man who had clearly done this before, more than once, with the calm efficiency of routine. I sat in that break room for a long time, phone shaking slightly in my hand, watching the recorded footage over and over, my mind racing between fear and a strange, sharp vindication, the specific relief of finally having proof, undeniable, time-stamped proof, after months of being told gently that belief wasn't evidence. I called the police immediately, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be, and was told an officer would be dispatched, though by the time anyone arrived at my apartment, nearly 40 minutes later, he was long gone, having stayed inside for just under 11 minutes according to the footage, moving briefly through the living room and kitchen before letting himself back out, locking the door carefully behind him with the same key that shouldn't have existed anymore. I want to tell you that the footage changed everything, that it was the clean, decisive piece of evidence that finally forced the system to act the way it should have in the beginning. It changed some things. It didn't change enough. The responding officer reviewed the footage with genuine seriousness, took a full statement, documented the incident formally in a way none of the earlier reports had been documented. But when I asked what would happen next, what consequence this would actually carry, I learned something about the specific, frustrating architecture of the law that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. Because the apartment had been mine during our relationship, because he had at one point legitimately possessed a key with what could be argued was implied permission to use it, the entry itself existed in a strange legal gray area, something the department could document as a concerning pattern of behavior, something that could support a restraining order application, but not something that met the threshold for an immediate arrest on the spot, not without a district attorney willing to pursue charges that weren't entirely clear-cut given the history between us.
I filed for a restraining order the next morning, footage in hand, my documented list of incidents stretching back months, laid out in careful, chronological order. It was granted, eventually, after a hearing that took nearly 3 weeks to schedule. 3 weeks during which I lived with the specific, exhausting vigilance of checking every room in my apartment before I could let myself relax. 3 weeks during which I barely slept in my own bed, choosing instead to stay with a friend more nights than not, unable to shake the feeling that my bedroom, the room he'd once made so carefully, so tenderly, without permission, no longer fully belonged to me. The hearing itself was smaller and quieter than I'd expected, held in a courtroom that felt almost aggressively ordinary. Fluorescent lighting, worn carpet, a judge who had clearly heard hundreds of cases exactly like mine and had developed a practiced, efficient way of moving through them. I sat at a table with a printed binder of everything I'd gathered, the photographs of the closed blinds, the moved dish, the made bed, the restocked refrigerator, the doorbell camera footage burned onto a disc, my handwritten list of dates converted into a typed timeline for the court's convenience. He was there too, across the room, dressed neatly, sitting with a posture of calm, wounded confusion, as though he genuinely couldn't understand why any of this was necessary, as though 2 years of a relationship should have entitled him to some permanent, standing invitation that no lock change could ever fully revoke in his own mind. The judge granted the order after reviewing the footage, citing the clear pattern of unauthorized entry, and I remember the strange anticlimax of that moment, expecting to feel triumphant, or at least relieved, and instead feeling mostly exhausted, hollowed out by months of having to prove something I had known to be true from the very first night the blinds were closed differently than I remembered leaving them. The restraining order helped in the sense that it existed, in the sense that violating it now carried a clearer, more immediate legal consequence than simply letting himself into an apartment he'd once had a key to. But I want to be honest with you about what a restraining order actually is, because I don't think most people understand this until they're forced to. It is not a physical barrier. It is not a lock, not a wall, not a guarantee. It is a piece of paper that makes consequences clearer after the fact. It does nothing in the moment itself to stop someone determined enough to ignore it. And for the first several weeks after it was granted, I lived with the low, constant hum of wondering whether a piece of paper would actually be enough to keep him out of a space he had already proven repeatedly he didn't consider fully separate from himself. He didn't violate it, not directly, not in any way I could point to with certainty. The cameras stayed quiet, the apartment stayed undisturbed. I want to tell you that meant the fear resolved cleanly, that I woke up one day and simply felt safe again, the way I had before any of this started. That's not quite how it worked. What actually happened is slower and less satisfying to describe. The fear didn't disappear, it just became something I learned to carry differently, a low background hum rather than a constant sharp alarm, present in small habits I never fully let go of, even months later, checking the cameras before falling asleep, keeping a bag half-packed by the door in case I needed to leave quickly, flinching slightly at unexpected sounds in a way I hadn't before any of this began. I moved almost a year later,
Not immediately after the restraining order, but eventually, once a lease renewal gave me a natural, unremarkable reason to relocate without having to explain to a new landlord or new neighbors why the woman moving in seemed so meticulous about her locks, so quick to install cameras before she'd even finished unpacking boxes. I never told my new neighbors the full story. I told them, when they asked, some version of the truth, thinned down to something easier to hear, that I had had a bad experience with an ex, that I preferred to be careful. Most people nodded, sympathetic, and didn't ask for more, the way people generally don't when a story is clearly being offered to them in a smaller, safer version than the one that actually happened. I still think sometimes about that made bed more than the restocked refrigerator, more even than the footage of him letting himself in with a key that should never have existed. The bed, because it was the moment I understood with total clarity what this actually was. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the kind of violence you brace for when you imagine an ex who won't let go, the version of danger that announces itself loudly, that breaks things, that leaves marks you can point to. It was tenderness turned into intrusion, care turned into control. A man who still believed, on some level I don't think he ever fully examined, that loving someone gave him a permanent, unrevocable right to their space, their privacy, their sense of safety inside their own four walls. I think about the officer who first sat in my living room, kind, sympathetic, genuinely wanting to help, and utterly constrained by a system built around forced entry, around broken locks and shattered glass, around the specific, visible evidence of violence, rather than the quieter, more insidious evidence of someone who never needed to break anything because he'd never fully accepted that the door had ever really closed on him at all. I think about how much evidence I had to gather myself, how much of the investigative burden fell on me, a frightened, exhausted person trying to build a case in the same apartment where the violation kept happening, before anyone with real authority was willing or able to intervene in a way that actually changed anything. I've spoken with a few other women since then, in the strange, quiet way these conversations tend to surface once you've lived through something like this yourself. People who recognize a specific look in your eyes or a specific hesitation in how you talk about an ex and open up in return. Almost every one of them described some version of the same pattern. Not violence, not at first, not in a way that would have been easy to report, just presence. Just the slow, patient erosion of a boundary that should have been simple and absolute, worn down instead by someone who genuinely believed with real conviction that love had granted him permanent access that no breakup could fully revoke. One of them told her ex had left flowers on her kitchen counter twice, both times while she was out, both times using a key she was certain she'd never given him a copy of. Another described coming home to find her thermostat adjusted to the exact temperature he'd always preferred when they lived together, a detail so small, so easy to dismiss that she'd spent weeks doubting her own memory before finally installing cameras of her own. If you've ever ended a relationship with someone who had access to your space and something in your home feels subtly, persistently wrong afterward, a dish moved a few inches, blinds closed differently than you remember leaving them, a bed made when you never make your bed, I want you to trust that discomfort completely, immediately, without waiting for it to escalate into something undeniable before you act. Change your locks the moment the relationship ends, not weeks later, not after the first strange sign gives you pause. Assume from the very beginning that any key given during a relationship might exist somewhere you can't see, copied at some point along the way, in some quiet moment you never witnessed and would have no reason to suspect. Document everything, even the smallest details that feel too minor to matter, because the system that's supposed to protect you moves on evidence, not on fear. And fear alone, no matter how justified, no matter how accurate, will rarely be enough on its own to make anyone with real authority act before something worse happens. I got lucky in the end, in the sense that nothing more violent ever followed the intrusions I've described tonight. I know that's not everyone's ending. I know there are versions of this exact story with this exact pattern, the quiet visits, the small domestic intrusions, the slow escalation from care into control into something far more dangerous that end very differently than mine did. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights, more than any single detail from my own experience. Not what happened to me, but what almost happened and what does happen to people whose evidence never quite meets whatever threshold the system requires before it's willing or able to step in and actually help. I think sometimes about how differently this could have gone if I'd waited even a little longer to install those cameras, if I'd let the friend who gently suggested I was imagining things talk me out of trusting my own instincts entirely, if I hadn't documented every small detail from the very beginning, even when each one on its own felt too minor to write down. I don't say that to suggest I did anything particularly brave or clever. I say it because I think about how close the whole thing came to staying invisible, unprovable, dismissible, a string of small domestic oddities that could have been explained away indefinitely if I hadn't happened to catch on camera the one unambiguous moment that finally forced the system to take it as seriously as I already had. If there's one thing I want you to carry away from this story, it's that the absence of broken glass doesn't mean the absence of danger. Some of the most patient, most persistent violations of a person's safety leave no marks at all, no forced locks, no shattered windows, nothing a system built around visible damage knows how to recognize as a crime in progress. The quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who let themselves in gently and leave everything looking undisturbed, except for the small, deliberate signs meant only for you to notice, are often the hardest to prove, and I've come to believe, some of the hardest to fully protect yourself from until you're willing to trust your own unease long before anyone else is willing to validate it.